Hi, this is Pete Thompson. Today we're going to talk about hazard communication. Hazard communication is basically the regulation you talk about when you talk about things like safety data sheets and labels and hazardous chemicals. Back in the olden days, before 1985, many of the states had different laws. And what they did in 1985 was they put one hazard communication law together for the whole country. And back a few years ago in 2012, they actually updated that to make it consistent with the whole world under what's called the Global Harmonization Standard. What they do is that way each of the countries has basically the same rules as far as safety data sheets and labels. We're going to talk a little bit about the purpose of the regulation, talk a little bit about each of the sections in the regulation, and talk about labels, pictograms, and safety data sheets. Basically, the purpose of the hazard communication standard is to make sure that you understand what the hazards of the chemicals are. And that's basically accomplished with three things. There's labeling, safety data sheets, and training. We're going to talk about all those, of course. This is the different sections of the standard if you're interested in looking at the standard itself. And you'll see that there are basically A through L sections. And most of them don't really apply. It's mainly those three sections that we're going to talk about. Hazard classification. Basically, each company that has a chemical has to figure out what the hazards are of it. And once they figure out those hazards, then they have what's called classification. And there's a big, long list of how that is done in the OSHA regulation. There, the classification basically in the regulation is in what's called Appendix A and Appendix B, and they have the different criteria to determine what the hazards are for the chemicals. This is a rather complicated table that basically I want to show you. There's two of these tables. The first one is for health hazards, and you'll see it says health hazards. And the second one is for physical hazard. A health hazard is anything that can obviously affect your health. So you'll see toxicity here, you'll see skin corrosion, eye damage, respiratory sensitization. Sensitization is like poison ivy. Carcinogenicity, which is giving you cancer. Reproductive toxicity. STOT, which is target organ. It's affecting a specific organ of your body. Aspiration is when you can breathe something in, and then asphyxiants. The biggest thing to know here is you'll see there's a 1 here, right? That means it's the most hazardous. So if you have something that's a hazard category 1 or an A, then you know that's a most hazardous material. On the other hand, you'll see the other side here is a 4, and it's the least hazardous. And you can see that there is a variety of different numbers that they give here. So it can be from a scale from 1 to 4. It also can be on a scale from 1 to 2, just depending on what the hazard is. This is the table for physical hazards, and you'll see that physical hazards are things like explosives, flammable materials, gases under pressure, reactive chemicals, oxidizers, corrosive metals, and combustible dusts. And these pretty much have the same thing. So you'll see that the lower hazards, or the most hazards, are the lower numbers, 1s and the A's. And the higher hazards are the higher numbers or the higher letters. And you'll see that here, like for self-reactive chemicals, it goes A through G. So it's a little bit different. Just because, so just remember, lower numbers, more hazard. Higher numbers or letters, less hazard. And here's an example of flammable gas, and you'll see that there's hazard category 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 is something that's very flammable. A 4 is something that's just combustible that really have a lot of hazards from. The other thing that's very important to remember, probably the most important thing in this whole training, is you'll see, again, this is a lot going on here, but you might have seen this diamond before. It's called an NFPA diamond, and it has numbers in it. And we're going to just focus on this one right here that's called flammability, okay? And you'll see that the flammability rating for this chemical is a 1. What does that mean? Well, that means that it's got a flash point of over 200 degrees, which means it's not going to really have very much hazard of burning. But you can see under NFPA, a 1, not dangerous. Under OSHA, or the GHS regulation, that would be a 4. The moral of the story is that OSHA decided that they should do it opposite. So an NFPA 4, very hazardous. GHS 1, very hazardous. So there's an opposite correlation there, and that's something that you need to be aware of. It's a little bit confusing. We also have to have a written program, and in there that's available. We have a written program for the company and for each plant, and there's all that information in there. There's a list of the chemicals. There's a little bit about non-routine tasks, and it talks about some of the other things. And it does also have a list of all the chemicals, so that's something that's available. Labels, we'll talk a little bit about labels. The label needs to have a product identifier, basically what it is, the single signal words, which is the hazard, either danger, warning, something like that. A hazard statement, we'll look at that in a second. The pictograms, we'll look at that, and then any precautionary statements and information on the manufacturer. OSHA allows a lot of variation as far as labels. So there may not be a label on a large piece of equipment that has chemicals in it, but if you have an operating procedure, that's okay. Also, portable containers. If you have like a 1-gallon bucket of a sample of something, you don't need to have a label on that if you're taking it from one place to another and it's under your control. Labels, basically, these are the requirements of labels. They need to be legible, they need to have the information, and it has to be in some sort of shape that it's not going to get ruined. These are what are called the pictograms. And you'll see there's 9 different pictograms here, and each one means a different thing, and they're mostly pretty straightforward. So you'll see the health hazard, it's what I call exploding chest man. It's a guy with a chest not in a good way. Flammable, which is the flame. Exclamation mark is something where it's got some hazard that it's not going to specify, like just random hazards, things like irritants, hazardous to ozone layer, things like that. Exploding bomb, it's going to explode. Corrosion, you've probably seen that on trucks before. It has like some stuff in your hand corroding away. Gas cylinders, gases under pressure. I'm going to jump over here. Skull and crossbones is the traditional toxic one. Aquatic toxicity, I can't see that very well, but it's a fish, a dead fish, and a dead tree. And then the last one is what I call the flame over the circle, which is oxidizers, which is something that can provide oxygen. And you'll see that's a flammable hazard, right? And you'll see that the flame and the oxidizer are sort of the same, but you see there's an O inside the oxidizer, so you know it's an oxidizer. Here's an example of a label. You'll see that there's a name of the chemical, the pictograms, the word, the signal word is danger or warning, and then they'll have just highly flammable liquid. They'll have a lot of information about how to prevent yourself from being hurt, what to do if you are exposed to it. Here's another example, pretty much the same thing. Chemical, pictograms, signal word, the hazards, prevention, response, storage. These are all specified by OSHA, so they're all pretty much standardized now. Safety data sheets. They've standardized safety data sheets. If you've been around for a long time, you know that they used to have all kinds of stuff in weird places. Now they're pretty much standard. If you get a safety data sheet from Germany, in German, if you can read German, it would have the same information in the same places, which makes it a lot easier to follow a safety data sheet. These are the 16 sections, and if you hopefully looked at safety data sheets before, they're pretty much the same. The beginning is what it is, then there's the hazards, there's the ingredients, first aid, fire fighting measures, release measures, handling and storage, PPE, physical properties, and then there's a bunch of other information at the end of it. There should be a safety data sheet in the workplace for every chemical that's in the workplace. So that's a requirement from OSHA, and they should be accessible during each work shift so that people can see them. And then we talked about some of the things there. There are, of course, emergency procedures in the safety data sheets too. One quick example on what's called an LD50, you'll see in some of the safety data sheets. It's called LD50 is lethal dose that kills 50% of the animals. So what they do is they take a chemical, they give a bunch to the animals, and they figure out how much of that chemical will kill half of the test subjects. And then they express it in what's called milligrams per kilogram. So basically what they do is they figure out how much is going to kill half the animals. So the example here is if the LD50 is 2 milligrams per kilogram, and you weigh 50 kilograms, which is about 100 and some pounds, you can multiply that milligrams per kilogram times the 50 kilograms, and you'd know that if you ate 100 milligrams of this particular substance, that you would have a 50% chance of dying. So the biggest thing to know is the lower the LD50 is, the more hazardous the chemical is. There's a couple appendices in the hazard communication standard. Again, they're more technical. So there's the criteria for the health hazards, and that's what tells you how to what to put in the labels. This one tells you what to put in the labels. Appendix D tells you how to lay out a safety data sheet. And those are all the sections of the safety data sheet, or sections of the regulations. So that's about it. If you have any questions on that, let me know, let your plant manager know, and thanks a lot.